let's talk about the very southwestern tip of South Africa. And you probably know that the world is divided up into different floristic kingdoms. And what is so remarkable, there are 6 globally. What is remarkable about the smallest one, which is the Cape Floral Kingdom, is it's tiny. It's 0.4% of the Earth's surface. But there are 9,000 species there, which is a plant species, this is. And that's a really remarkable level of hyperdiversity within a very small area. And associated with that, 2 out of 3 plants that you're going to find are going to be endemic to the Cape. So the level of endemism is really high. And I'll return at the end as to some of the possible drivers of this. And we don't really have clear answers to that. You can't do an experiment to show, like, oh, it's because of this or that. But you can do comparative biology, and there have been some comparative analyses. So this is my talk structure. The first is an absolute promo for why you should visit the Cape, okay? Why it's so great, and I hope, I'd actually like to get a show of hands. Who has actually been to the Cape and botanized there? Okay, so there are a lot of people who know this area very well. So for those who've not been there, I hope this will inspire you to say, maybe I should take a holiday down there. It's great. 10-hour flight from Heathrow, almost no time change. Rent a car and off you go. And I should say, for those of you who are worrying about security, South Africa has a bad reputation for security, and I tend to stay clear of Durban and Joburg. But this general area is a pretty safe area to be in, particularly if you're out in the bush. So I'll start off talking about why you should visit the Cape, some pretty pictures. Then we'll talk about 2 particular families where there is just spectacular adaptive radiation. And I'm going to focus very much on the sex lives of these species because that's my shtick. I work on reproductive systems and mating systems. And then I'll sort of transition into case studies, and I'll talk about 4 particular studies that I've been involved in over the years with Cape plants, each with a completely different topic. Actually, the last 2 are about mirror image flowers, but I'll be wandering around here conceptually, talking first about highly specialized pollination systems involving birds. The second is a sort of an old story that goes back to my graduate days at Berkeley with Herbert Baker, who invented this term, the general purpose genotype. And he used, as an example of this, an oxalis species that is actually from the Cape. And I want to tell you about some work I've been doing on that particular lineage with colleagues. And then I'll finish with Cyanella and Wachendorfia, which are 2 endemic genera that occur in the Cape that have this unusual polymorphism called enantiostyle, but you can think of them as mirror image flowers, and I'll describe exactly what they are. So, again, why do you want to go to the Cape? What's so great about the Cape? Well, there are great botanic gardens there. Here, I've just chosen 3 here. Kirstenbosch, it's a World Heritage Site, and I'll show a better photograph of it later. Clan William is up in the Cedarburg, and that's a wonderful botanic garden. It's about 3 hours north of Cape Town. Then at Worcester, there's a wonderful botanic garden that specializes in succulents. It's in a dry area, and of course in this general area is the Karoo desert, and so what with Namaqualand and the Karoo, this is also, for those of you like succulents, it's a wonderful place to go. And the South African general public are really into botany. I've never been in the country. It'd be hard to beat Brits for that. But there's something about going to South Africa where people are very excited about the spring floral displays, and there are flower routes. So this is a particular map that I've found where, follow this route and you can see some pretty cool floral displays. And this all happens in August, September and October. That's the sort of, after the winter rains is when the big blooms occur. Also what's great is that there are terrific field guides there. There's a history of great botany being done from Stellenbosch and at Kirstenbosch and other centres. Great botanists who've written very, very handy field guides, which are very helpful, of course, when you're in the field. I mean, I can say this particularly because I happen to be in a province of Canada that's close to, it may even be bigger than the size of Texas. We don't even have a flora, let alone a field guide. And the number of species is trivial compared to the number here. So they've worked really hard to produce excellent field guides, which are helpful to the neophyte going there for the first time. And then, people just love plants. I mean, I just randomly took these 4 pictures. Bruce Anderson on the left, I'll talk a little bit about. He's at Stellenbosch. He's a mate of mine. I did my first sabbatical with him. He said, there's a couple of people who'd like to come along, and we were going to look for this plant. And, I was thinking, certain kind of stereotype botanist. Well, they come in all shapes and sizes, all ages. People are really interested in going out looking for plants. And then this place over here, Neupertville, and if there's any people from the Netherlands in the audience, and I think there's one, I've completely mangled that pronunciation. It's a hard one for an English speaker, but Neupertville is the bulb capital of the world, literally. I mean, it's where you go if you want to see wild species of geophytes. These are species that have corms or bulbs. This is just a smutty comment by the side of the road. I like big blooms, I cannot lie. This is a fantastic nature reserve. One of the centres for nature reserves for floral displays is a little town called Darling, which has a great brewery and is a wine growing area. But there are lots of really great nature reserves there. And so I first went there with Bruce Anderson. He's there running around with a butterfly net because he's a pollination biologist. So anyway, flower power in Cape. Here's another thing that I'd never come across before, but in Cape Town every year, they actually have a kind of a festival of wild species. And you can go and they've laid out all of the things that are in bloom. This is just a small segment of it, and with the names, which is really helpful, given the number of species that are there. So wildflower shows are something that I hadn't come across. Of course, we've all come across horticultural exhibits, and Britain is great for that, and everybody's been to the Chelsea Flower Show. Not everybody, because it's probably too expensive for most people nowadays. But here we're talking only exclusively about wild species. Okay, so what my wife Suzanne and I do when we fly down there, one of the nice things is no jet lag, it's a 1 hour time change. We pick up a rental car at the airport, and the first thing we always do is just drive to Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden, which is at the foot of Table Mountain. It's my favourite botanical garden in the world, and I've been fortunate to be in many. And there's some pretty good ones in Scotland. I was at Logan in June, and that's a great botanic garden. But this is an amazing botanic garden. It's got fantastic collections of Ericaceae, Proteaceae, Iridaceae, and it's also very beautiful because it's, as I say, on the side of Table Mountain. It's got a great restaurant and wonderful sculptures all the way around the botanic garden. So there's a lot of public art, if you like, which is good. And then, what we then do is after we settled down and got our stuff, we then head north. And I'm just going to show you a couple of floral display shots as to why I like going there. And, people who've been to the Mojave Desert in spring bloom, there are shots like, you can go to California too. So it's not the only place that has this, but I think they're absolutely fantastic. This is one of the most famous places. It's called the Bedo Valley. It's in the northern Cederberg, which is a mountain range, and people come from all over the place in buses and so on just to photograph the floral displays there. This happens to be also one of our study site areas where we got permission from local farmers to work and do work on the genus Cyanella, which I'll talk about later. So that's the Bedo Valley. This is at Neupertville, and these are just geophytes. So these are all, Actually all of these are in the Iridaceae. The red-flowered plant, which is really spectacular, is a Romulea, for those of you who know that genus. And then this is another amazing plant, Bulbinella. This is a hybrid zone between two subspecies of Bulbinella latifolia, which again is just south of Newfoundland. And then just north of Newfoundland, you start to get into drier areas, and this is where we can see this famous tree. It used to be an aloe, but there's been a molecular systematic study of the genus, and now it's been shifted into another genus. But this is a wonderful area. These are the geomorphology, the landforms, and there's quite some concern about this right now, this species, because of climate change. You might think, well, it's a succulent, it can handle drought, but actually these things are incredibly sensitive to real, serious drought because they're adapted to certain levels of rainfall. So there's been quite a lot of work on whether the sort of demography of these plants. They're all all these plants here are bird pollinated. This species is bird pollinated species. All right, so I want to take you into the world of plant sex here. And as an evolutionary biologist, when I look at a flower, there are a couple of things I obviously think about, and that is, how does it mate? Because remember, the flower is the organ that plants produce to secure mating through getting pollinated and then getting fertilized. And so, it's kind of important. And one of the interesting things about flowers is those flowers in the angiosperms vary more than any other sexual organ of any organism on Earth. If you go from something like a tiny little flower of an Arabidopsis to these, huge aeroid titan flowers, Rafflesia, some of these things are 1 meter across, as opposed to something that might be a couple of millimeters. They're all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors and scents, but they've all been produced by the same process, natural selection. And so natural selection has given us this amazing diversity of form and function. And they all have one function: mating. That's it. Why aren't all flowers the same? Surely there's some optimal design there. Since, mating is going to be the outcome. Well, you don't have one form of flower. You have an incredible diversity of floral shapes and sizes and so on. And so the job of a evolutionary biologist like me who works on plant reproduction is to try and understand what selective forces have been at work to bring about this diversity. And I'll say right off the bat, to use a North American expression, here's an incredible set of diverse floral structures. We haven't a clue why they are the way they are. So there's so many unanswered questions here. And actually, if you take the number of people who are working on adaptive, floral function, working on we're talking about half a dozen people who are trying to figure this all out with 8,000 or 9,000 species. So we have a few partial solutions. But certainly in the case of these species here, this is a Protea, Disa is an orchid, and then these three are what used to be scroffs, now they're in their own groups. And, the question is, why are they the way they are? Now, the working hypothesis that myself and several others have cooked up over the last years, particularly David Lloyd, who is the real founder of modern plant reproductive biology, that these have been selected through sexual selection to increase male siring success. In other words, to secure more matings through pollen dispersal. And I won't go into the details of those concepts now, but that's the kind of way we would move forward. We'd think, these are male traits. They're like ornamentation on animals, the peacock's tail and all of that. So colours are also amazing in the Cape. This is a very unusual colour combination. I can't think of anything in the British flora that combines, this red-blue is a very unusual colour combination. This is And it's in a family where this has evolved repeatedly. These are 3 different species that have independently evolved this particular color pattern. It's given the name the wine cups syndrome. There is some evidence that this is an adaptive response to monkey beetle pollination. Monkey beetles are incredibly common and diverse in the Cape, and they do like this plant, and there has been some efforts to show how they actually pollinate these flowers and so on. That little inset there involves 2 species of Geraniaceae in different parts of the genus, and I don't know whether no, I haven't. But the one to the left is actually in a completely different genus. It's in Babiana, so it's independently evolved. So we get a lot of color combinations. We also get amazing variation within a species. So those of you who know sundews, which of course are quite common here in Scotland, that's the genus Drosera. There is an adaptive radiation of Droseras in the Cape. There's 2 adaptive radiations of Droseras worldwide, one in Western Australia and another one in the Cape. And so there's 30 or 40 species of Drosera. These are all within one species, all this color variation. And monkey beetles may also be involved. There's some monkey beetles down in that red one that may be well attracted to that greenish color. And then what you often find is different colored monkey beetles that match the color of the flowers. But, there hasn't been a rigorous study of this. It's been mostly anecdotal, natural history observations. So that's variation between populations. Hold on to your seats. I'm going to show you a photograph. I had the pleasure of looking at this variation with Bruce Anderson and Steve Johnson, who worked, they're a couple of great pollination biologists. Let's look at the variation within a single population of Morea, another iris. It's what is maintaining this variability, as you probably know, those of you who have at least some sort of understanding of evolutionary biology, you probably know that evolutionary biologists, when they're confronted with this kind of or any variation or any trait, they say, well, it's either deterministic processes, that means natural selection, driving adaptive changes, and, these are the products of evolution by natural selection, and the only other alternative hypothesis that we entertain is what are called neutral processes, things like genetic drift and stochastic forces, that they've just arisen by chance. It'd be kind of hard to swallow that this is all chance, but actually nailing down why and how has not been done. There is one paper in Linsock by Steve, Bruce, and a graduate student that essentially documented fly visitation to these. So it looks like flies are kind of important in this variation, but, we're not talking about really, rigorous kind of, using genetic markers and figuring out who's mating with who and so on. Very, very interesting. Okay, now I mentioned horticultural motherlode in my title. Some of you may be aware that many of the very familiar plants that we're used to here in the British Isles, in Scotland, I should say, are originated from the Cape. Many of the plants that we grow, pelargoniums, gladiolus, freesias, I could go on, but many, many plants originated because collectors collected them from the Cape, brought them back to botanical gardens in Europe, particularly Kew and almost certainly here, and started to work with these plants. And then they started to get selected by plant breeders, and we now have them in our gardens. The source of variability down there for this is amazing. Just think of the number of ericas we have in Scotland. Now, I was trying to get my facts right before I put this talk together. So I looked up, I'd always thought there were only 2 ericas in the UK. But then I looked up and said, oh no, actually there's 6. And, funnily enough, I was down in Cornwall last week and I had a pleasure to see an endemic erica that occurs on the Lizard Peninsula. So, I guess there are 6, but There's 777 in the Cape. You know, it's only a tiny area. And you can go on a hillside through the Fynbos and see 30 different ericas all coexisting. There's a lot of variation in their pollination systems. Many are bee pollinated, some are fly pollinated. There's a whole bunch that are bird pollinated. And that little bird there is one of the key pollinators. That's a sunbird. Just recall that there are no hummingbirds in the New World. In the Old World. There's a lot in the New World, tropics. There used to be hummingbirds in the Old World. In fact, there are fossil remains of hummingbirds from Europe. But I guess they were all wiped out for whatever reason. And so bird-pollinated plants in Asia, in Africa, are pollinated by different groups of birds, not hummingbirds. And particularly in Africa, the sunbird genus is pretty important. There are other birds that pollinate flowers down there, but as we'll see, the sunbirds play a major role. There's a lot of floral diversity here, so, you know, clearly there's been pollinator-driven adaptive radiation. In Erica, there are even, I think it's 4 separate transitions to wind-pollination. So you have wind-pollinated Ericas as well as animal-pollinated Ericas. Now let me move on to a particular family that is, you know, it's kind of the poster child, I guess, for the Cape. And I'm sure some of you at some stage have been to a florist and forked out quite a lot of money for things like proteas or leucadendrons. They're great plants to have in vases because they last for so long. Their floral longevity is terrific. And they're flown up. Some of them are even grown here in nurseries. This is the one of the most famous ones, Proteaceae cyanoides, and a lot of the proteas are animal pollinated by birds. Some are pollinated by beetles, some by bees. But in Proteaceae, there are, of course, other genera. And I want to tell you about a particular genus that I have done a little bit of work on, and it really is a little bit. And that's the genus Leucadendron. This is what Leucadendron looks like. There are 80 species that are endemic to the Cape. And what's very interesting about Leucadendron is some of you may know, particularly those of you who follow the scientific literature, that there's been a bit of a sort of debate in the literature about when dioecious, separate sexes, that's the term we use for it, when separate sexes evolve, so for it, think of holly, think of yew, the yew tree, think of cannabis, where there are separate male and female plants. Of course, most plants are hermaphroditic. They have both male and female sex organs. But about 6% of species of flowering plants have separate sexes, and they're called dioecious. And a lot of people early on were arguing that when dioecious evolves, and we know based on comparative analysis, that it evolves from hermaphroditism, so you have hermaphrodite populations, and then they're invaded by males or females. Usually it's females invade first, and then once females are in the population, males come in. Once dioecious evolves, they're generally associated with genera that don't have a lot of species. I mean, I spent a lot of my career working on the genus Sagittaria, where there's one dioecious species, and then something like 35 monoecious species. They're species that have male and female flowers on the same plant, like maize, corn has male and female inflorescences. So this particular plant, this lineage is really not like the typical dioecious lineage because it's actually quite species rich. There's 80. There's been an adaptive radiation here. And in fact, that adaptive radiation is involved in some very interesting pollination transitions. Most of them are beetle pollinated. Some are pollinated by bees. And as we'll see in the next slide, some are pollinated by the wind. So there are transitions to wind pollination. What I'm showing you here is a population that we worked on. Well, this was Suzanne, my wife, and I worked on. We did all the sampling for this. And it was just because I've always been interested in sex ratios, because obviously you don't study sex ratios if you're working on a species that only has hermaphrodites, because everybody is the same. They all produce male and female sex organs. But once you have a dioecious species with separate sexes, you can ask the question, what is the ratio of males to females? And theory tells us, going back to Fisher and even before Fisher, Dusing, they should be 1-to-1. The 1-to-1 sex ratio is kind of a classic idea. It's driven by what is known as negative frequency dependent selection. So whenever I come across a dioecious species, I always say, oh, I wonder what the sex ratio is. And so what was interesting here is we noticed that there was male bias sex ratio in young populations. And how did we know they were young? Because the South Africans keep very good fire histories in the fynbos, and we knew when the burn was that gave rise to the establishment of these populations. And these plants have what are called serotinous cones. They actually have cones, rather like many pinus do, at least in North America, which will only shed their seeds after a burn. So you get a burn, the population is decimated, there's no canopy, the seeds are then sprinkled over the landscape, there's plenty of nutrients because you have all that ash, they germinate and form a new population. That's a very common strategy in Proteaceae and in other groups. So we knew the fire history, and actually another thing that I should say is we could verify these records because you can also age them by the number of branches. They have an absolutely standard branching pattern. So what you notice here is in young populations, well, at least 6-year-old populations, you have 3 classes of plants. You have males, females, and V is vegetative. They're non-reproductive. But then as you get into older populations, you get the 1-to-1 sex ratio. And this fits a general pattern in angiosperms, and this is based on some work that David Field and I and Melinda Pickup did, where we surveyed sex ratios right across the angiosperms where data was available. And male bias sex ratios are very common. And what it is simply that when people take sex ratio data, they go into a population and they count the number of males and females, and they ignore non-reproductives. And so often what is happening is they've got a biased sex ratio because they're not including those individuals that haven't yet reproduced. So, I mean, this is just simply saying for people who are interested in sex ratios, do some demography. You'll probably find they're at 1-to-1 if you actually follow them for a reasonable period of time. We don't have strong sexual dimorphism, not as we do in many animals. Many zoologists are obsessed with sexual dimorphism. There's almost a cottage industry in studying sexual dimorphism and sexual selection and so on and so forth. Most of our dioecious species, ones that have males and females, are not terribly different from one another. That's not the case here in Leucadendron. On your right is a male and on your left is a female, and these were once classified as different species. But what you've got here, I mean, I'm going to come up with a just so story here because it's not being studied, but it kind of makes sense. This thing's wind pollinated. And so I think what we've got here is essentially architectures that optimize reproductive success for the particular sex. I mean, a male, it has to, push out tons of pollen into the wind. The female has to receive pollen. And you just need different architectures and also different photosynthetic capabilities for that kind of different sex role. Now, that's a hypothesis. I mean, it'd be interesting to do some work. It's never been done to actually try and figure this out. All right, I'm going to change now to another family that you're very familiar with, all of you, I'm sure, because everybody knows what an iris is like. And I chose this particular photograph because it's one of the most beautiful iris gardens in the world that I've been lucky enough to go to, just outside of Shanghai. There's an amazing iris garden there. And so, we all know what an iris is, right? So when I first went to South Africa, I was completely flummoxed by, particularly being out in the field with Bruce Anderson. I'd say, oh, what's this? What family is this? He says, it's an iris. This isn't an iris. And I'll show you why I was confused. And that these are all irises. Now, this one you can probably get your head around because it's rather like a gladiolus, and a gladiolus is an iris, basically. But some of these other ones are just completely different. And so this is an amazing radiation. There are 707 species, 27 genera. Incredible. That, by the way, up there, the one in the right-hand side, is Sapromyophilus. It's a carrion fly, pollinated, and it stinks to high heaven. It's like many aeroids that go in for that pollination strategy. This is the more familiar genus, Gladiolus, but again, 260 species. Just hyper-diverse radiation here. And I mean, if you're a breeder, this is wonderful because if you can get to bring in some genes from these wild species, and I'm sure the Gladiolus breeders have done that. I don't know anything about the history of Gladiolus breeding. Now, this is another iris genus, Laperousea, and this was a great discovery that Bruce and I made when I was on sabbatical there. Essentially, in the guilds of pollinators there's a guild of pollinators in South Africa, which we don't have in the Northern Hemisphere. It does occur down in the Himalayas, but these are long-tongued flies. I mean, you probably wouldn't think of that as a fly, but it is. I mean, as an aside, when I sent that photograph to my lab, because I was on sabbatical, one of my more witty graduate students, Chris Eckert, said, "Hey, boss, you put the insect pin through the wrong place." And I said, "That's the tongue." And what's interesting about these flies is, unlike Lepidoptera, they don't coil them up. So they fly around with these. They look very awkward when they're flying. But anyway, a little story we cooked up, which Bruce and his student carried on with a new phytologist paper. Bruce and I published a paper in JEB showing that there was a bimodal distribution of floral tube length. So these are the two tube lengths within a single population. And of course, we were like, how is that being maintained? Surely they're mating with one another. And then Bruce and his graduate student used what is called quantum dots to actually see where the pollen was being deposited. And it turns out this is a great system for assortative mating. The short tube plants mate with short tube plants because that pollen is on a particular part of the fly. And the long tube plants mate with other long tube plants. And work in the first paper showed that there was actually some reproductive isolation developing based on genetic markers, work in my lab, where we showed that actually the pollen tube growth rates were also different between the two. If you mix pollen, you got more assortative mating than mating between the forms. So these pollinators are very, very common, and a chap called Steve Johnson at KwaZulu-Natal has done some terrific work showing adaptive radiation to different tongue lengths and so on in different. To move on to another iris, this is Babiana. Babiana has about 6 pollination guilds, in other words, groups of pollinators that are either birds or flies or particular kinds of bees and so on. But there's a bunch of them, not that many. Here, there's 3, in fact, 4, that are bird pollinators. And I want to tell you a little story about our discovery about this, because this came, it wasn't planned. I went down on 2003 on sabbatical, and for various reasons, it was very hard to do work on mirror image flowers, because it had been actually a very, very dry year, and so the species I wanted to work on weren't doing their thing. And I went out into the field with Bruce, and we saw this. And, I kind of said to Bruce, I wonder what's going on there. And he said, yeah, nobody's worked on that. And I turned to him, I said, well, we're going to. And so we collaborated. And, if you look at that, now you know it's bird pollinated. You could probably cook up an adaptive explanation and say, well, it's a perch. The plants evolved a perch, right? It might sound fanciful, but, that's probably a good working hypothesis. So Bruce, who's a terrific photographer, said, well, if we photograph pollination in action, maybe we can get a nature paper. I said to Bruce, we're not going to get a nature paper from just a pretty photograph. We have to do an experiment. So we did an experiment. And it did get in Nature. So what we did was and it was so simple-minded, and I think there are lots of issues with this, study, but I think the basic story is correct, and that is, you've got a perch, and so the perch facilitates cross-pollination by malachite sunbirds. These are the largest sunbirds, and what they do is they fly in, grab the perch, turn upside down, and then they're just exactly in the right position to get pollen smeared on their body to be transferred to stigmas. So, here's a very simple and, not super convincing in terms of, well, does that say anything about the evolution? And that is, we just said, well, what happens if we cut it off? By the way, for the zoologists in the audience, eat your heart out. Because one of the great things about being a botanist is you can manipulate the sex organs, you can rip the sex organs out with tweezers, and you don't need some animal certification certificate. So we cut them off. And it turned out there was visitation. And what was interesting was that there was definitely some sex difference. That's a very unusual photograph. It's just about the only male that we saw going to ground. There was clearly an issue about males which have a long tail that they actually display. I don't think they like getting their tail in the sand. But essentially when they probe, they don't touch the sex organs. So essentially, it's not an effective mechanism for pollination. So what we did is we used genetic markers, and we did this in a couple of populations, and we looked at the outcrossing rates, what proportion of the seed came from cross-pollination in the two treatments, how much seed was produced. And we showed essentially that the perch functioned to promote more precise pollination and outcrossing and maintain fertility. Well, how did it evolve? Well, we don't know. But one hypothesis that I think really deserves serious attention, have done a little bit of work on this. My graduate student, Caroli Daval, wrote a nice paper on this in AJB, is the most likely sister group is this thing here, Hirsuta, which has flowers all the way up its inflorescence. And in fact, you occasionally find Babiana with these sort of the suppression of those branches on the inflorescence. There clearly were mutations that essentially suppress lateral branches on the inflorescence. And, maybe those mutations have got some sloppiness, poor expressivity and so on. And that's the final bit, so they only have flowers on the ground. So what could drive that? Well, by studying these populations, we notice a huge level of antelope herbivory on higher branches. So one possibility is that, consistent herbivory, where they just nip off these high branches, but they don't go to the lower ones. It could have acted as some selective force, and then these ones with lower flowers, maybe birds then took advantage of the inflorescent stalk, which was left, and pollinated in the fashion that Babiana ringans. It's a working hypothesis. We certainly documented the herbivory, and it was position dependent. All right, so now let's move to another couple of genera. This one is very interesting. We've got one species here in Scotland and in fact the UK. And I'm sure most of you go out in the field to coniferous forests and you see Oxalis acetosella. It's all everywhere. We have an equivalent species in eastern North America. There's 150 species of Oxalis in the Cape, and they all have tristyly, which is this complicated sexual system where the population is reproductively subdivided into 3 mating groups that mate with one another, and pollinators are transferring pollen largely between the forms. And I'm not going to go into any of the details of that except to say that my PhD thesis was on tristyly, and I've spent most of my career working on the polymorphism, and I'm pleased to say that We finally found the genes controlling this. Just have a paper came out in MBE this month, doing the full Monty on the molecular genetic architecture of the linkage group that controls this polymorphism, not in this group. But Herbert Baker was fascinated with oxalis because one species broke loose. There's actually more than one has done it, but one has been very, very successful. And so Herbert was fascinated, and he was my supervisor at Berkeley, as I said. And he said, you know, there's a mystery about this thing. You know, it must have come from South Africa. Somebody needs to go there and, you know, count chromosomes and figure all this all out, because it turns out all of these populations in the true Mediterranean, California, Chile, and Australia, so there are 5 Mediterranean regions in the world, including South Africa, and this is now colonized 4 of these regions, and being native to South Africa, they all have the predominant invader is a highly sterile clone of a pentaploid version of this species. Okay, so plants are often polyploid, they have multiple genomes, so you get whole genome duplication. And so these invasive species are being extremely successful throughout the world, not because of sex, because there is no sex. You know, there's no sex going on in California or Chile or, you know, where, because if you're a pentaploid, you can't make functional gametes. And so how do they spread? Through bulbils. They make these little sort of small structures underground, which get transferred around, almost like seeds. And so through clonal spread, these things have moved around the world. So, I mean, one of the things that Vicky Ferrero, who was a visiting professor in my lab, and myself, we were very interested in this. And so we did a couple of studies where we said, well, let's have a look, try and go to South Africa and figure this out. And we don't have a good answer to this. And here's the reason. When you go and count chromosome numbers throughout the Cape Floristic Kingdom, you can't find pentaploids. They're only known from 2 places in the Cape, and they're both botanic gardens. So there's a mystery here, you know, and in fact, we've even wondered, maybe they came from somewhere else to South Africa, but where are wild pentaploids? You know, one possibility, I mean, here's a hypothesis, that these highly clonal and very good for ornamental work in a way, because you can clone them, they've got pretty flowers. In fact, as Herbert used to go and get outraged about vernacular common names. He said, common names are a curse. And he said, you know, take Oxalis substorfia, Pescapri. He said, you know what its common name is? Bermuda buttercup. It's not from Bermuda and it's not a buttercup, but that is its common name. So it's one possibility, as this was generated in a botanic garden through crossing diploids and tetraploids and so on, then became a kind of useful horticultural plant, and then was taken to South Africa. We don't know this. The molecular ecology thing is a microsatellite analysis of variation all over the globe, but it doesn't solve the problem. All right, so I'm going to finish now briefly with mirror image flowers. So this is where the flower has left-handed and right-handed sexual organs, and I'll show you some photographs of this. There's a schematic, and it's evolved independently. These mirror image flowers have evolved independently in 11 animal-pollinated families, and they're very closely associated with nectarless flowers. The flowers produce no nectar, so pollen is the reward. Pollen being a reward is a risky business for a flower, right? Because they're gametes. So these have evolved what are called a system called heteranthry, where essentially what you do is you sacrifice some of the pollen in one set of anthers. They're called feeding anthers, and you say, you know, hey, we'll give you some pollen, and then there's usually a cryptic pollinating anther that the pollinator doesn't see that slaps the bee on either the right or the left-handed side of the body. And that's the way it works, and this is all being documented experimentally. And it promotes then mating between the morphs. Now, it turns out it's a bit more complicated than that, and I'm not going to go into the details, but there are two forms. One, you have left-handed and right-handed flowers on the same plant, and that doesn't make sense, because if you think about that, well, that's going to give you selfing, because you'll get transfers between left and right and left. But if you actually do the thinking about this, you say, well, what was the ancestor of that? It was straight-soiled. And with a straight-soiled ancestor, there's potentially transfers between every flower. So this at least reduces those transfers by a half. And then, in a few cases, you go full genetic. So that's now where you have separate left and right-handed plants. And so Lindley, Jessen, and I did a lot of work on this early on, and we've now continued with this work. And I'm pleased to say that the postdoc who worked on this is from Edinburgh. She did her undergraduate work here. Her family lives here, or her mother lives here. And that's Alice Fairney. And so she, for 3 years, has worked as my postdoc on this project, looking at Cyanella, and I'll show you. There's a very interesting genus, 9 species of geophytes, in a family that most of us had never heard of before you came here, the Proteaceae. It doesn't roll off the tongue. It's not something that occurs in Europe, as far as I know. And there are 2 species of Cyanella that have this mirror image flower. So we're doing a phylogeny of this group. It's interesting because there's only 2. The remaining 7 species have straight styles, but they all have this condition of heteranthry, where you have this division of labor between the anthers. And so again, not getting into a lot of detail, we focused on this one up here because this had been reported as having the genetic polymorphism. In other words, there's a left-handed flower to the left there, and you can see the feeding anthers at the top. That's what the pollinators go for, and they buzz them, because these are all buzz pollinated. No nectar, remember. So this is just like Solanaceae, where there's buzz pollination. And then the pollinating anther is the one deflected to the opposite side to the style, and then there's the reverse morph. So the question became, well, what is this? Is this dimorphic? Is it, genetic? Or is it not? And as I say, earlier reports suggested, this is the genetic case, and it was even I fell for that. But then when I started thinking about it more and looked at it, I thought, well, this is actually a lot more complicated than it seems, because when people diagnosed it as having this dimorphic enantiostyle, left and right-handed plants, they just went into a population and looked at the flowers on a plant. Well, the mean number of flowers produced by a plant in a day is 1.9. So most plants actually produce 1 flower. Some produce 2, some produce 3. And the trouble with that is, you can hardly be sure, right, that they're not going to produce the alternate flower type, next week. So, what do you do under a circumstance like that? You do demography. So we did demography over 2 years where we marked 130 or so plants in 3 populations, and we followed every flower. And we showed that, hey, they have monomorphic enantiostyle. In other words, plants have this capacity to make both left and right, but on any given day, they're usually just one or the other. There's a lot more complication here that I can't get into because this is non-genetic. My molecular colleague, Michael Leonard, was convinced it was going to be genetic. And like many molecular biologists, he threw tons of money at this. And I said, why don't you wait until we do the demography? Oh, no, we can find, we got to find some SNPs that co-segregate with left and right. I said, well, you can't be sure it's a left-handed or a right-handed. Next season, it might be the opposite. Anyway, Michael was very gracious when I said, there you are, I told you all along. You've just wasted 150,000 euros on sequencing. Anyway, the last part of this story is that the fact is this system is breaking down at the range limit where there are white-flagged populations. And what is happening here is I'm just showing you some data quickly of what happens if you self-pollinate the flowers. You get no seed, or very little, they're self-incompatible. If you cross-pollinate them, you can get much more seed. But what is happening in nature? they're chronically pollen limited. They're just not being buzzed. And so we have a paper in South African Journal of Botany showing chronic pollen limitation. There are no buzz pollinating bees visiting these things. And what happens if, season after season, you're chronically pollen limited, you might want to give up that adaptation of heteranthry. And we think that's what's happening. Here are the unmodified populations where the anthers are connected at the top, but we have a whole lot of populations where there's been mutations, we assume, we're trying to find those mutations, Michael Leonard's doing that right now, that they've broken apart, and now you don't need to be a fancy buzz-pollinated bee to get the pollen, and so we're getting weevils and all kinds of things. So I think it's, to be more general about it, this is potentially a very exciting example of a transition from a highly specialized pollination system based on buzz pollination to a generalist pollination system because of this chronic pollen limitation. All right, so I want to bring in a Scottish angle, okay? And I'll simply say that the other project we've been doing down there is on this plant, and the reason it's of interest is because the first paper that was ever written on it was in the Transactions of the Botanical Society of Edinburgh. And this also is a plant that has mirror image flowers. And Suzanne, my wife, took that photograph in Logan, where there was one of the Wachendorfias growing, and it was almost like, God, I've gone all the way to South Africa to study this thing, and it's growing in Scotland, of all places. What accounts for all of this? The answer is we don't really know, but there is a very good paper here by Schnitzer, who did very detailed comparative analysis, and they come to the conclusion that it's abiotic selection through soil heterogeneity and topographical variability. Those are the things that come out as the major drivers of species diversity in a whole set of speciose lineages. That's not to say that pollination isn't important. It's in there, but not as important. All right, those are the people who've helped out, and I know I'm over, so I'll stop now.